Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I want to talk about macros. Now, I've made videos on these in the past, but with the popularity of Shadowbringers, I wanted to create some sort of new PSA on do's and don'ts of macros, so let's just get started. First of all, I'm definitely going to be criticizing certain uses of macros here for general players. I see a lot of stuff that I just don't agree with that's inefficient, and it's honestly kind of my own fault. I've done some of these things I say not to do when I first started playing A Realm Reborn, so I can totally understand how a new player thinks these things could help them when they could actually be hampering their efficiency. I will say though that if you're dealing with a disability or a handicap, or you're just casually playing through the story, you're not doing any like hard content or anything like that, I'm not going to sit here and dictate how you should enjoy 14. If it gets you through the door and you're having a good time, then continue doing what you do. However, if you're looking to be optimal, improve your gameplay, then some of the things that I'm saying here might help you out. Now with that, I think we should establish the most basic thing you need to know about macros. They ignore the game's built-in skill queue. What is the built-in skill queue, you might be wondering? Well, when you press any of your skills, the game actually queues up your next button press about half a second before the skill can be used. So in this example I have on the screen with the global cooldown, when you're about 2 seconds into waiting for the global cooldown to be available, if you press a skill, it'll store that skill and queue it up as the next thing to use in an attempt to cut out any latency, which really helps the player be as optimal as possible. Now for off global cooldowns, it works roughly the same way, and after things like limit breaks and potions, the queue is actually much earlier. So as we stated earlier, macros ignore this queue, meaning that the skill can only be activated after it's entirely available. On the screen, you'll see me trying to use the same 3 basic skills that machinists use, but with them set as macros and no other things macro to them other than just that skill as a macro. And you can see that it just doesn't work. I have to wait till the skill is completely available to use it. I'm going to use a few of the non-macroed skills to show you the difference in this footage directly. Now, once in a while, this isn't too noticeable, and there are definitely applicable reasons to use a macro in combat. But when you are constantly pressing macroed skills, the difference in efficiency gets noticeable fast. Ignoring the spell queue can also cause the off-global cooldown skills you may have tied to them to be completely ignored if you press them too early before the game's innate delay between skills has elapsed, which is also about 0.5 seconds. So with that, the biggest don'ts for macros. Don't try to condense or chain together skills with a single macro. I have seen a fair share of gunbreakers attempt to do this with a few things, which is actually one of the major reasons I'm making this video. They're not the only ones, but I've seen a lot of them. The first macro I see is a continuation macro, which condenses all of the buttons that are part of continuation into a single spammable button press, so Gnashing Fang, Wicked Talon, and Savage Claw, as well as all 3 of the continuation abilities. Over the course of a fight, this is going to eat at your job's efficiency big time, especially if you're not just using it for this and you're also using it for other things. Now, even worse are macros that try to do multiple skills in a single button press, meaning you press it and it executes a number of skills in the order you've set them. So a continuation macro I've seen people use is they try to put the whole combo to execute in order, starting with Gnashing Fang all the way to the end in a single button press, using wait times in between. Now, we've already described why this is an issue with spell queuing, but this brings us to issue with macros number 2. One big reason this hurts so bad is because the wait timer must be done in integers. If you set it to a decimal or any non-integer number, it will round to the nearest integer. So the game's base global cooldown is, 2.5 seconds, and I mentioned that 0.5 second delay between skills. It doesn't really work out. You can't do wait 0.5 or wait 2.5. It doesn't work. So you'd be waiting a minimum of 1 second or 3 seconds for either of those to go off with a wait macro, and that's even more noticeable across a fight. So that's a bigger no than even the first thing. So going back to the condensing thing, there's another type of condensing macro that I want to talk about. We already covered an offensive one with continuation, but I've seen people try to run defensive ones with tanks. So there's other issues with this. Not only does spell queuing not really work with macros, but the game doesn't actually do the priority of the skills in a macro the way you have them ordered. So here you can see I have a Gunbreaker defensive skill macro, and so I've seen people do this where they're like, oh, these are all my defensive skills, and it'll pop one, and I'll always be set. I could just press this instead of pressing them all individually. And they try ordering them from top to bottom, like, well, I'll always want to use Heart of Stone first, and then this one, and that one. But despite this, it won't always work in this order. I mean, heck, I wasn't even trying that hard to get an example of them being pressed out of order, and the very first time I pressed this macro, it used the 4th skill down. It used the other 3 in order, but you can see that it's just not reliable, and when it comes to tanking cooldowns in particular, this is not something you can afford to have happen out of order, and sometimes if you run into the issues we've already named, it may not happen at all. Now those are some big don'ts with macros, and I'm sure I could find more don'ts, but I also definitely want to cover do's, because there's absolutely places where macros can be useful in 14. Now I mentioned chaining skills together as a bad type of macro, but that's only in combat. In crafting, there are actually a ton of incredibly common macros that chain crafting skills together. You know, technically, yeah, there's spell queuing, and you know, there's the potential of a skill going unused and wait times with integers, but it's crafting. Set a longer wait time and just press the button, and as long as it's an easy enough recipe, it'll chain the skills together well enough to complete it. Heck, right now, go to Google, go to Ash 10's Crafting is Dead macro to get an idea of what I'm talking about. There's other way more basic functions for in-combat uses as well. Sometimes it's just placing a text on a macro to alert party members that you're using a big cooldown. This is, of course, if you're comfortable with timing that ability so it doesn't fail to activate. Again, without spell queuing, off global cooldown skills are really, really dangerous to do this with, but eventually you do develop a rhythm, and at the very least you can prevent it from failing to activate. You'll often see this with things like resurrection spells or tank invuln cooldowns to let people know you've used them. Just don't use it for stuff you press super often, and don't put random quotes from animes in them. It's annoying, to say the least. And anyway, another solid use is adding target modifiers to certain skills, and I see this used a ton. I'd say this is probably the most common combat application, especially for certain jobs. I'd highly advise looking through the macro guide on the lodestone, but you're going to see a few examples of different target modifiers that you can change using macros. Probably the most common one I see is this: Dragoons using a mouse over or party member target macro for Dragon Sight, so they don't have to drop target from the enemy they're fighting to place a tether on a nearby player to then go back to the target. It saves a lot of time, and again, once you're comfortable with hitting it between the global cooldown, you shouldn't have any issues with it at all. Another one I've been seeing for years is jobs with ground AoEs. Now, instead of having to actually place the AoE on the ground, something like Salted Earth or Asylum, you can instead just choose to use a macro to drop it at the current target's location, under yourself, your focus target, anything the macro will allow, really. You know, I just mentioned Dark Knight's Salted Earth, and that's probably the one I see it with most often nowadays. I've seen other people use them for like the healer bubbles, like Sacred Soil and Asylum, like I mentioned earlier. Over the years, Shadow Flare was a big one. Rip Shadow Flare. But it can be really useful to have those ground spells targeted on a certain player. Japan also has some of my favorite macros, pug macros or pickup group macros. Basically, they'll go into the raid finder or the party finder, and they'll join, you know, something for like Savage, for example. And they'll paste the entirety of what needs to be assigned position-wise in the chat, and the players just call their assignments. You know, here in North America, we have plenty of ways of doing that. Some people prefer to use voice comms, some people prefer to put down like a 1 or 2 marker, which is really popular with Titania. They just do this and then call it out in the chat, and there's very little need for communication after that. And I think that'll be a wrap for covering at least the most basic things about macros. I didn't even talk about one of the biggest cons, which is that macros can interrupt macros. So if you were to press a macro that has a sequence of skills going, and then you try to press another skill or a macro, it'll just cancel the macro that was already going, which is another huge reason why they're generally not that effective to use. But I could go on and on. This video could be way longer. Let's just say we've covered the basics, and if you have any recommendations on things you should or shouldn't do in the comment section, be sure to throw those down there. Keep in mind, though, I'm sure people will be judging them, whether or not they are good or bad. So just be ready for that as well. And yeah, one last thing, this isn't even on the script, so I might stutter a bit through this, but if you're just someone who's using these because you think you have too many buttons on the hotbar, you may just want to look at the actual hotbar options in the game and see if there's something you can do to help out. I know a lot of people don't actually re-keybind their hotbars. You know, you can add Shift, Control, Alt modifiers, and MMO mouse is immensely helpful for adding new skills to the hotbar. On top of that, maybe you could just adjust a few hotbar settings. People who use controller, you know, don't forget you have the cross hotbar and you have the double cross hotbar. You should be able to have up to 48 keys actually accessible at all times with a relative ease on a controller if you go through those settings. I've done videos on that. I know other YouTubers have done videos on the cross hotbar and the double cross hotbar, so definitely be sure to look into those a little bit. And also consider prioritizing what your most useful skills are. You know, if you're someone who has emotes mixed in with their combat skills, you might want to consider separating those and making some room instead of, you know, going and using macros to condense skills as opposed to that. So those are just a few little additional pieces of advice that more pertain to the hotbar and less to macros, but I find that the two things are interchangeable, especially with newer players. And with that, that's going to be a wrap for my video on macros. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and let me know if there's anything else you want to know about this topic, because I'm sure I could dive deeper into it, but this is the most basic stuff. So thank you again for watching, and until next time, take care.